If you feel the urge to explain yourself, pause, because the moment you start justifying, respect starts leaving. The most powerful people don't defend their choices. They let silence do the work, and everyone else adjust. The moment you start explaining yourself too much, something subtle shifts in how people see you. It doesn't happen loudly. No one announces it, but respect begins to thin out, almost invisibly. Over-explaining doesn't sound like insecurity on the surface. It sounds logical, responsible, polite. You think you're being clear, transparent, fair. But underneath that explanation is a signal you may not even realize you're sending. You're asking to be accepted rather than standing to be respected. Authority doesn't come from how well you defend yourself. It comes from how little you feel the need to. When you over-explain, you're not just sharing information, you're negotiating your position. You're telling the other person that your decision is flexible, that their agreement matters more than your boundary. And people, consciously or unconsciously, respond to that. They start to test you. They push back. They ask more questions, not because they're curious, but because they sense space to challenge. Think about the people you respect the most. They don't give long speeches for every choice they make. They don't rush to clear up every misunderstanding. They don't feel threatened when someone doubts them. They speak once, maybe twice, and then they stop. That pause isn't weakness. It's confidence. It says, I know where I stand even if you don't. Over-explaining, on the other hand, says, I'm not fully settled unless you agree with me. When you explain too much, you also train people to believe they are entitled to your reasoning. Today it's an explanation. Tomorrow it's justification. After that, it's permission. Suddenly every decision requires approval. Every boundary becomes a debate. You don't notice it happening because it feels gradual, but one day you realize people don't accept your word anymore. They expect a presentation. They expect evidence. They expect you to prove yourself again and again. Over-explaining often comes from a good place. You want to avoid conflict. You want to be understood. You want to seem reasonable. But respect doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in clarity. When your words are excessive, your clarity gets diluted. The core message gets buried under details, emotions, and defense. Instead of hearing strength, people hear uncertainty. Instead of seeing leadership, they see hesitation. There's also a deeper cost. Every time you over-explain, you slowly teach yourself that your decisions aren't enough on their own. You start to rely on external validation to feel solid. You measure the success of your choice by how well it's received rather than how aligned it is. That internal shift is dangerous because once you lose trust in yourself, no amount of explanation will restore respect from others. People don't respect those who constantly defend their position. They respect those who are comfortable standing in it. Silence after a clear statement is often more powerful than 10 extra sentences trying to soften the blow. Silence communicates certainty. It communicates emotional control. It communicates that you are not shaken by disagreement. When someone challenges you and you immediately rush to explain, you hand them control of the interaction. You're reacting instead of responding. You're playing defense instead of holding ground. And the person on offense always feels more powerful. But when you pause, when you speak briefly and stop, the dynamic changes. The other person feels the weight of your certainty. They feel the boundary instead of hearing excuses around it. Over-explaining also invites disrespect because it creates an opening for manipulation. People who like control listen carefully to explanations, not to understand you, but to find loopholes. The more you talk, the more material you give them. They twist your words, pick apart your logic, and drag you into arguments you never needed to enter. A firm statement leaves little room for games. A long explanation creates endless doors. Respect is closely tied to emotional self-regulation. When you over-explain, it often means your emotions are leading the conversation. Anxiety, fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing connection. But calm authority doesn't come from fear. It comes from acceptance. Acceptance that not everyone will agree. Acceptance that some people will misunderstand you. Acceptance that you don't need to correct every false assumption to remain grounded. The strongest people understand this. Being misunderstood is not a threat to their identity. Over-explainers treat misunderstanding like an emergency. They rush to fix it, correct it, polish it. But every rush exposes urgency, and urgency weakens presence. When you slow down, when you let misunderstandings exist without immediately reacting, you demonstrate inner stability. And stability is deeply respected. Over time, people learn how to treat you based on how you treat your own words. If you treat your words like they need defending, others will treat them like they're questionable. If you treat your words like final decisions, others will feel that weight. This isn't about being rude or dismissive. It's about being precise. One clear sentence, delivered calmly, carries more authority than a paragraph fueled by nervous energy. Explaining yourself once can be clarity. Explaining yourself repeatedly becomes insecurity. There's a difference between communicating and convincing. Communication states. Convincing pleads. Respect doesn't come from being convincing. It comes from being consistent. When your actions match your words, explanations become unnecessary. When you keep your boundaries steady, people stop asking why. You don't lose respect because you're wrong. You lose respect because you don't trust your own position enough to stand quietly in it. The need to explain is often the need to be liked. But leadership, strength, and authority were never built on being liked. They were built on being grounded. When you stop over-explaining, you stop leaking power. You stop inviting debate where none is needed. You stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. The less you justify, the more your presence fills the space. The fewer words you use, the more carefully they land. And slowly, people begin to feel something shift. They don't argue as much. They don't push as hard. They don't demand explanations they're no longer entitled to. Not because you forced respect, but because your certainty made it natural. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness, avoidance, or lack of confidence. But in reality, silence is one of the clearest signals of inner authority. When you don't rush to explain yourself, you communicate that you are not shaken by reactions, opinions, or pressure. Silence tells people you are grounded enough to let things settle without interference. And when silence is paired with consistency, it becomes a form of power that explanation can never replace. Consistency is what makes silence credible. Anyone can be quiet once. But when your behavior stays aligned over time, people begin to understand you without words. They learn your standards. They learn your limits. They learn what you will and will not tolerate. And once that pattern is clear, respect follows naturally. Not because you demanded it, but because people feel the structure of who you are. When you explain yourself repeatedly, you rely on words to manage perception. When you stay silent and consistent, you allow actions to do the work. Actions don't argue. They don't negotiate. They don't contradict themselves when emotions rise. Words can be challenged. Patterns cannot. This is why consistency builds respect faster than justification. Justification changes based on who you're speaking to. Consistency remains the same no matter who's watching. Silence creates space, and in that space, people project meaning. If you fill every pause with explanations, you control nothing. But when you hold silence calmly, others are forced to sit with their assumptions. They wonder, they reassess, they pay closer attention. Silence shifts the power dynamic because it slows the interaction down, and the person who controls the pace often controls the outcome. Consistency reinforces this effect over time. The first time you don't explain, people may feel uncomfortable. The second time, they may feel confused. But eventually they adjust. They stop expecting more words. They stop pushing for justification. They begin to understand that your silence isn't uncertainty, it's finality. That's when respect begins to stabilize. People who rely on explanations often feel busy but powerless. They are constantly responding, clarifying, correcting, defending. People who rely on silence and consistency appear calm but influential. They don't chase understanding. They let understanding catch up. This difference changes how others engage with them. Conversations become shorter. Arguments lose energy. Challenges soften before they fully form. Silence also protects your emotional energy. Every explanation costs something. It costs focus. It costs emotional regulation. It costs time. When you explain too much, you drain yourself trying to manage how others feel. Silence, paired with consistent behavior, removes that burden. You don't need to manage reactions when your actions already communicate your position. This conservation of energy contributes to presence, and presence is deeply respected. Consistency builds trust even among those who don't agree with you. People may dislike your decision, but they will respect its predictability. They know where you stand. They know what to expect. That reliability creates a sense of safety, even in disagreement. Over-explaining does the opposite. It creates uncertainty. If you keep adjusting your message to gain acceptance, people stop believing there is a solid core underneath. Silence also forces accountability outward instead of inward. When you over-explain, you take responsibility for how others interpret you. When you stay silent and consistent, others must take responsibility for their own interpretations. This shift subtly elevates your position. You are no longer chasing clarity, you are embodying it. And embodiment is far more persuasive than explanation. Many people fear silence because they think it means losing control. In reality, silence often reveals who has control. The person who is comfortable not filling the gap demonstrates emotional security. They are not dependent on immediate feedback. They are not anxious about approval. That calm self-sufficiency is what people instinctively respect, even if they can't articulate why. Consistency ensures that silence is not misread as confusion. When your behavior remains steady, silence becomes reinforcement rather than absence. Your repeated actions speak on your behalf. Over time, people stop asking questions you no longer answer. They stop crossing lines you never redraw. They stop testing limits that never move. Respect forms quietly without confrontation. Justification invites debate. Silence invites observation. Debate is noisy and draining. Observation is subtle and powerful. When people observe consistency, they internalize your standards without you teaching them. This internalization is what makes respect durable. It doesn't depend on mood or moment. It becomes part of how others relate to you. Silence also communicates emotional maturity. It shows that you can tolerate discomfort without reacting, that you don't need to correct every misunderstanding to feel stable, that you trust time and patterns more than immediate validation. Emotional maturity is one of the strongest foundations of respect, and silence is one of its clearest expressions. When you pair silence with consistent action, you remove the need for persuasion. You don't convince people who you are. You demonstrate it repeatedly. Demonstration is undeniable. It doesn't rely on interpretation. It doesn't weaken under pressure. It accumulates weight over time. The fastest way to lose respect is to say one thing and do another. The fastest way to gain it is to do the same thing consistently without explanation. People may question you in the beginning. They may misunderstand you briefly. But consistency outlasts confusion. Silence outlasts noise. And eventually, what once needed explanation becomes understood without a single word.